golden age of science fiction refers to the period 1938 to 1946, when science fiction magazines gained a wide audience for the genre. We'll be reading 3 stories by authors that were all active and influential in this period or shortly thereafter. From 1938 to 1946, the magazine Astounding Science Fiction popularized science fiction and established many of the themes and conventions that dominated the genre for decades to come. Soon, other SF magazines vied for attention, including Galaxy and the Magazine of Science Fiction and Fantasy. Of the 3 stories I'm asking you to read for this lesson, only Isaac Asimov's Nightfall technically falls in that period, but SF magazine stories continued to reign through the 1950s. Asimov, Philip K. Dick, and Robert A. Heinlein were all influential in magazine fiction at mid-century, and all also wrote novels that continue to be considered SF classics. The stories I've chosen from them illustrate 3 common subjects for SF. Nightfall investigates life on other planets. The Defenders features robots, and All You Zombies involves time travel. Even though the stories imagine speculative worlds very different from our own, they probe conflicts very similar to our own. Next week, in the introduction to The Left Hand of Darkness, you'll read Ursula K. Le Guin's comment, "Science fiction is not predictive, it is descriptive. Writers don't tell you what you will see and hear. All they can tell you is what they have seen and heard." In other words, SF creates new settings in which to explore our own world. This week, we'll be looking at what the assigned stories might reveal about life in the mid-20th century when they were written, and in our day. First up is Isaac Asimov, Nightfall, published in 1941. The beginning of the plot, which is called the exposition, gives clues about the setting and the conflict. The bottom of the first page says that Aten 77 stared moodily out at the skyline, where Gamma, the brightest of the planet's 6 suns, was setting. It had already faded and yellowed into the horizon mists, and Aten knew he would never see it again as a sane man. This tells us that the planet Lagash, where the story is set, has 6 suns. It also hints at an impending catastrophe. Aten then explains the problem. The only visible sun will soon be obscured, creating darkness on Lagash for the first time in living memory. And not only that, but scientists predict that when darkness comes, civilization as we know it comes to an end. This creates tension for readers. Will civilization actually end as predicted? And if so, why? We on Earth know what's happening. This is a solar eclipse. But the characters in the story have never even experienced darkness, let alone an eclipse. Can you imagine what it would be like if the sun had been constantly visible for the past 2,500 years and then it suddenly went dark? This situation creates dramatic irony, since readers know what darkness and solar eclipses are, but the characters in the story do not. The physical conflict of the coming eclipse creates a context for the social conflict. The scientists of the story predict that when the darkness comes, all of civilization will become engulfed in flames, as it has many times before. They have been urging the public to be prepared and have secured a hideout in a cave, but no one has believed them. The cultists, meanwhile, predict that the darkness will be punctuated by stars, and that these stars have robbed men of their souls and left them unreasoning brutes. So they're also trying to persuade people to prepare, but to do so spiritually, to prepare their souls for the coming of the stars. Then there's everyone else, represented by Theramond, the journalist. The public is skeptical of the claims made by both the scientists and the cultists. Theramond says, "This is not the century to preach the end of the world is at hand to Lagash." You have to understand that people don't believe the Book of Revelations anymore, and it annoys them to have scientists turn about face and tell us the cultists are right after all. The discussion forum is going to ask you about the roots of this social conflict. Pay attention as you read to what kinds and sources of knowledge the characters trust, depending on their alignment in the story. Next up is Philip K. Dick's story, The Defenders, published in 1953. Dick's story belongs to a subgenre of SF called post-apocalyptic fiction. An apocalypse is destruction on a catastrophic scale. Post-apocalyptic fiction imagines what kind of civilization would arise in the wake of that destruction. It allows writers to investigate human nature. If people were to start all over again, would life be better, worse, or the same as the current world? The Defenders was published in the post-World War II era during what is called the Cold War. This was a time when the US and the USSR, or Soviet Union, were vying for world dominance. This image shows NATO states aligned with the US in blue and the Warsaw Pact states aligned with the Soviet Union in red. Since both the US and the USSR had nuclear capabilities, there was fear that nuclear war would break out between them and possibly engage the whole world. That is actually what has happened in the Defenders. Following the nuclear holocaust, humans retreated to life underground. Ironically, they entrusted robots called Leddies to continue carrying out the war on the surface on their behalf. Just like in Nightfall, the conflict of the story involves sources of knowledge. Humans living below the surface get all their information from the Leddies. Commander Franks points out the insecure position that puts humans in. He says, "We must rely on indirect evidence since none of us goes above. We can only infer what is going on. We never see anything ourselves. We have to take it all secondhand. Some top leaders are beginning to think there's too much room for error." I'm sure you can see parallels to both Philip K. Dick's time and our own. Trusting information means trusting the source that transmits that information. And when that trust is broken, people don't know what to believe. When I was talking about Nightfall, I mentioned the first stage of a plot, which is called exposition. In the exposition of the Defenders, we learn that humans are living underground after a nuclear holocaust, and Leddies are continuing the war on the surface. We're also introduced to our protagonist, Taylor. Then the conflict starts ramping up. This phase of the plot is called the rising action. During the rising action of the Defenders, the humans begin to suspect the Leddies are lying to them. They start to investigate and get more and more confirmation that something's going on. The climax of a plot is the moment when the plot reaches its greatest tension. In a superhero movie, this would be when superhero finally faces off against the arch-villain. In the Defenders, the humans go to the surface and face off against the Leddies, who are forced to admit that they have in fact been deceiving people. The climax is also called the turning point because it's when the action stops rising and begins falling to lead to the conclusion or resolution. In the Defenders, much like in Mistake, the turning point involves a central irony. The humans had been right about what the Leddies were doing, but they were completely wrong about why they were doing it. The discussion forum asks you to analyze the differences between humans and Leddies and how the story proposes bringing an end to war. Finally, we have Robert A. Heinlein's story, All You Zombies, published in 1959. This story involves a time paradox, which is something SF loves to think about. A paradox is a logical contradiction or seeming contradiction. The idea of time travel brings about all kinds of possible paradoxes. The most well-known example might be in Back to the Future, in which the main character travels back in time and nearly prevents his own parents from falling in love, which would then prevent him from ever being born. I can't really talk about this story without giving a lot away, so I recommend that you read the story before going past this point. The mind-bending paradox Heinlein explores is that when the main character travels back in time, he doesn't prevent his parents meeting. He, in fact, becomes his own parents, his own father and mother. You have to watch the video posted in the lesson to work this out. The video takes the plot and lays it out on a chronological timeline. Then once you figure it out and reread the story, you'll pick up on lots of irony and foreshadowing, such as the song that's playing on the jukebox. For this plot to work, Heinlein's protagonist has to be born intersex, meaning having both male and female biological characteristics. The character is assigned female gender at birth and raised as Jane, but then due to complications in childbirth, their female anatomy is removed and they emerge from the surgery with male gender. I'm going to ask you to analyze how sex and gender are imagined in the story. A little context. At the time Heinlein wrote the story, surgery was just beginning to emerge as treatment for intersex people and transgender people. These conditions were starting to be recognized by the public, but they were seen as abnormalities that required treatment. In 1952, the transgender woman Christine Jorgensen became the first American to undergo sex reassignment surgery, and her story made front-page news. In the late 1950s, doctors began to perform surgery on intersex babies to make them look like typical male or female babies. It's fascinating to see how Heinlein pulls these historical events into his SF story. I particularly want you to pay attention to that because our next book, The Left Hand of Darkness, also features characters who might be considered intersex, but by the time it was published exactly 1 decade later, a lot had changed in American culture. You'll definitely see a huge difference in how Ursula K. Le Guin imagines sex and gender. I want to introduce another important literary element to you, symbol. A symbol is a person, place, thing, or event that figuratively represents or stands for something else, generally something more abstract. All You Zombies has an important symbol introduced in the exposition. When the barkeep is first speaking with the unmarried mother, he shows him a ring he wears. He says, "It just looks like a wedding ring. I wear it to keep women off. The worm Ouroboros, the world snake that eats its own tail forever without end, a symbol of the great paradox." Ouroboros is an ancient symbol that represents the endless cycle of destruction and rebirth throughout history. It's significant in Heinlein's story because the protagonist is in an endless loop of giving birth to themselves over and over again. But it's also significant because the snake consumes itself. We can see the psychological toll of that self-consumption in the final scene of the story. At the end, the protagonist looks again at their ring and says, "I know where I came from, but where did all you zombies come from?" There's been a lot of talk about what this line means. It's obviously important. Whenever the title of a text shows up, you know it's important. But who are the zombies? I'm not going to answer that for you. I'll just point out that virtually every character we meet in this story is the same person. That's why some critics have connected this story with the philosophical concept of solipsism. Solipsism is the view or theory that the self is all that can be known to exist. As humans, we're very egocentric. We spend a lot of time in our own minds thinking about ourselves. Imagine how that issue is magnified in this story, in which the protagonist's seeming interactions with other people are actually just interactions with themselves. It makes you wonder, do we ever really know and understand anyone else? Or are we always just projecting our own thoughts onto others? I'm going to ask you more about the theme of this story in the discussion forum.